Welcome to the Black Box of Media, brought to you by Ultimate Edge Communications. I'm your host, Aleisha McCall, and this is episode 12. This podcast lifts the lid on the hidden strategies behind high-performance marketing and media advertising. If you've ever wondered why some campaigns absolutely crush it and others fall flat, this is where we break it all down. In this episode, I am joined by Lauren Drummond. She is the Chief Marketing Officer at Sydney Fish Market. She spent the last 5 years helping guide one of Australia's most iconic institutions through a once-in-a-generation transformation. And if you have been living under a rock, you are the only people that will not know that the Sydney Fish Market has just opened. Absolutely fabulous. I've been down there myself and checked it out. It's an incredible location, and I'm so excited to speak to Lauren today. This conversation isn't just about the hype of an $830 million opening. It's really about what it really takes to lead marketing at the intersection of brand, experience, and commercial reality. Lauren is going to take us inside the evolution of her role from marketing manager to CMO, leading through uncertainty without the perfect information, which is so important in this fast-paced world that we live in. We're going to talk managing multiple profit centers, multiple stakeholders, and the challenges that are associated with that, and really balancing the pressure of today's revenue needs with long-term vision for growth and not losing sight of that. So I'm so excited for our listeners to hear from Lauren firsthand. This is going to be a masterclass in what modern CMO leadership is actually looking like. So Lauren, I'm so excited to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Aleisha. That was quite the introduction. So I'm really excited to be here and to chat to you about those many facets that you've already touched on.
Amazing. Well, I had to do it justice. You know, the conversations that we've had, I've just really enjoyed hearing from you firsthand on the journey. And I think it's a really unique journey and experience that you've been through. And so for marketers to hear firsthand while it's fresh in your mind, obviously just coming off the back of the opening, is a pretty incredible story. So Lauren, do you want to start by just giving us a general overview of sort of what this last, especially 12 months, have looked like for you, where you've been, the journey that you've been on, and the lead up to this opening of this iconic Sydney Fish Market that we now see standing tall today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that concept of evolution is strong, and the way I find myself saying the word journey a lot, which can feel cliche at times, but it really has been incredibly multifaceted kind of journey. But I suppose in the last 12 months, it's really been the period where our transformation has kicked into full gear. So whilst the building was sort of emerging up out of the water on Blackwater Bay, we were in the old fish market, as it is now kind of coined. And we were really focused on not only ensuring that business continued in that market for the period, so we had no downtime in between, but really what were the key aspects of the transformation across the portfolios that I'm responsible for. So it was really, I guess about breaking those things down in terms of timing, and we were often not in control of that timing as well. I think the most important thing to point out with this project is the sheer amount of stakeholders that were involved. So from government, who were obviously developing the site, right through to all of our customers across our many sort of business operations. So managing all of that and trying to get it to sing all at the same time was challenging, to say the least.
That's very well put. And I think before we get into all of these questions, I would just love you to talk to, the moment, the day it opened. Obviously, you'd been through so much. There'd been so many delays, so many setbacks, so many challenges. Can you just give us a little bit of a picture of what it felt like? Because obviously you'd been there for that 5-year journey and the lead up to it. What it just felt like on the day to finally have, have this beautiful location opened.
Yeah, it was absolutely surreal. I mean, there was one thing to be within the building itself in such a spectacular kind of landscape and very contrasting to the old building. But I think in terms of the delivery of, this moment, that was really quite something. And to have all of those stakeholders there to celebrate what is a really monumentous and once in a generation project and finally share it with the public, that felt like a really, special kind of moment. don't get me wrong, I don't think I really took time to kind of think about it until maybe a few days after.
And probably the lack of sleep leading up to it
Yeah.
might have had something to do with it as well.
Yeah, I was definitely a little stressed that day, but yeah, once I had a moment to
Yeah.
kind of take it all in, it was really special, and to just see people's response to something that when you're so in it, even as a marketer or whoever across the organization, we were so in the detail, and to have the impressions of people coming through, their first impression, but also their sort of broader feedback, that was a real special moment for me as well, to kind of, embrace all of those
Yeah.
things that come along with a project like
And
this.
it's so important because you work, outside of the marketing and the media advertising, you put so much into it. You work so hard for these, and very few get to experience these big moments, right? Where you kind
Yeah.
of look back in your career and you go, wow, that was something special. And as they say, pressure makes diamonds. And I know you've absolutely crushed it. And the Sydney fish market's certainly a diamond. So I think that's a good,
Absolutely, I do. I like that. I'll use that one for
There you
sure.
go. You're welcome. Everyone who's listening needs to get in there and check it out. It is spectacular, and the fish is extraordinary. I can say that firsthand. Well, look, now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the journey, what it takes, and the lessons and the insights that you can share with our listeners of really what this unique experience provided you and how you've been able to get to this point of not only pre-launch but now very real in the moment of launching this and attracting new consumers to visit it. So one of my first questions is very much around this sort of leadership and role evolution.
Yeah.
So one of the things I found myself thinking about is, with such a big project with so many variables, how did you lead without having all the answers? So it felt to me like you would, in a lot of moments, you were in quite a high degree of uncertainty. So I'd really love you to speak to that for us.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of perhaps take a step back and share with the listeners around the portfolio itself. So in terms of the kind of ownership, obviously our core business is wholesale seafood trading, about $170 million a year. So my portfolio kind of sat over that. Then obviously all of our property operations in terms of the tenants across the site. And then importantly, the sort of visitor experience elements as well. So that involves Sydney Seafood School, which is our cooking school facility within Sydney Fish Market.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of our tours and merchandise and the way we sort of show up for visitors as a brand. So I think, that's a very multifaceted portfolio, and through the 5 years of the transformation, it grew and grew. And I think, in terms of leading with uncertainty, the biggest thing for me was the team, in terms of I'm not going to have all the answers all of the time. And really kind of bringing them along that journey. I think often, obviously, you're looking to your leader to provide that certainty. And there were many times that we had to lean into that. It was timing, it was, details of project, it was stakeholders, it was all of those sorts of things. And I think the biggest thing for me was kind of, we're on this together. I'm, focused on the things that I can control for the team and to kind of give them the certainty that they could have at that time. But everyone kind of had to lean into the fact that, there were many, many aspects of it that we just didn't have that, kind of control over. So I think for me, it was really, how do we kind of go on this journey together whilst kind of trying to keep momentum at the same time? Because that can be difficult when things are chopping and changing so kind of drastically in some cases.
Yeah.
So, how do we just kind of steady the ship, for lack of a better term, to ensure that we're ticking the things off that we need to? Yeah.
100%. And I'm curious to sort of understand how you did that personally, because often I find that, yes, you've got to obviously, as a CMO, you've got to manage those teams, but you also have to manage, all the conversations and all the things that are going on here in your mind of the things that need to get done. And I often kind of feel, hearing about your experience firsthand of, that duck on a pond, right? So it's like up top, you're elegant, you're graceful, you're moving along, but underneath those legs are going like, crazy with all the things that need to get done. So in those moments where you knew you sort of had to stabilize the team and that kind of things, or things did change, how did you manage that from your point of view to set yourself up to be able to go to the team and say, look, hey, this is where we're at, this is what's changing, this is what needs to be evolved, or hey, I need all in because we got 48 hours to pull X together?
Yeah. I would say, and I wouldn't profess to have nailed it every single time, but I think it was mostly around, balancing that kind of BAU and transformation, and really kind of focusing on that in those team environments to kind of say, okay, what is the here and now that we need to do? We're operating a fish market, still got millions of visitors a year.
Still got to hit the revenue targets, right?
Exactly. And then how do we also kind of couple that with, the transformation projects that are happening? And I think a lot of it really, from my perspective, was my own prioritization of those things, but also breaking that down for the team, because I think there were many moments where the overwhelm on both sides, leadership and, the broader team, felt like too much. And I think it really was, how do we break this down almost day to day, week to week? And, as a kind of, as I like to say, classically trained marketer, you want to have this strategy and
the playbook
and all of these things, and we want to be reporting all these amazing metrics. Sometimes we just had to really break it down to basics. And, it didn't always feel like it was comfortable to be in the day to day or the week to week, but that was often where we needed to be. And so just kind of that surety around that for, the broader team as well, that we're all in that boat together, and that, that might not feel great at the time, but it's the right thing for that moment, I think.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And actually, I think that's a great segue, because one of the things that I talk about a lot is, transitioning businesses from 1.0 to 2.0 and how important that is. And as we move into 26 with these, conversations around how do we create agentic enterprises and how do we now get our businesses ready for this next era, which in a lot of cases just happens to be AI. But for you, it was a very real, 1.0 to 2.0 transition. You were taking this established, successful, iconic fish market and then turning it into a brand new, completely evolved, and in a lot of ways, very different institution. And you had a lot of, to speaking to the stakeholder play, you had a lot of like traditionalists, a lot of core stakeholders that you needed to come on that journey. And so I've got so many questions in and around this, so I'll try and break them down. You can probably hear my energy behind this. But I really, to me, the value of, as a marketer, being able to bulldoze in a lot of ways that nicely, but bulldoze that transition to make it successful and to know, okay, well, where do we invest? Where do we not invest? So can you give our listeners a bit of a picture on that 1.0 to 2.0 journey, and really how did you decide during that time, which it wasn't a short period of time, it was actually a long period of time. How did you decide where to invest and what to do, what not to do during that transition? And did that change as you went through?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it definitely changed throughout the process, and the balancing of that BAU, as I said, with the transformation at times felt tricky. But what I would say is, for me, it was really about how do we identify the key aspects of this transformation, and break those things down into that kind of deliverable. And for us, the biggest part to begin with was the brand. So I came in 2020. This is a business that knows this thing's coming out of the water. It hadn't yet started. There was a lot of moving parts. You had the COVID impact. You're sort of trying to run this site, and there was a lot of questions like, why are you focused on the brand now? And for those who are not as familiar, the brand had a mark of a gentleman holding a fish. It was pretty well known in some areas versus others, but very well established overall. And so I got a lot of pushback around, why are we pulling this trigger first? But we recognized that whilst this was a strong established brand, it needed to move into the future. And it may not have been the perfect time to do it right in that moment, but it was the first kind of, I guess, cab off the rank.
And almost the catalyst too, right? The catalyst into the future.
Exactly. And, there were a lot of lessons within that for me in terms of that timing. And as I said, you as a marketer, you're always kind of holding yourself to this accord about things being perfect, particularly a rebrand. That's the kind of foremost kind of thing. You need all of the parts to sort of go together in terms of launching that. And for me, it was really, we just have to get this going. And, we were really fortunate to have great supporters in Interbrand who facilitated that, process with us. But a lot of it, and the kind of key part for me, was that stakeholder journey. So you've got this place steeped in history that people are very tied to what goes on. You've got people that have worked there for 40 years. You've got this affinity for something. And really for me, it was, how do we take that affinity and that love for the place and turn it into a foundation rather than the kind of brand itself, and kind of build off that foundation into, that kind of first
Yeah, you're taking the history with you. It's like, we're respecting the history, we're respecting what got us to this moment. But in
Absolutely.
order to meet the future moment, to that next moment, we have to be able to evolve, we have to be able to step up
Yeah.
and really bring all of that goodness into one. How did you balance heritage with the need to modernize during this rebranding process?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because it's a brand that's obviously steeped in heritage about, I think about 35 to 40 years with the sort of same kind of look and feel in lots of ways. And for us, it was really about, identifying those kind of key parts of the brand that we needed to honor moving forward. And through the process, obviously identified what, many marketers would be familiar with the sacred cow concept. And for us, it was the blue crate. So it's the mechanism for trading the seafood across our floor each day. And, it branded it and appears all over the country and if not the world, I would say as well. So for us, it was really the essence of the brand kind of is in that crate. And how do we kind of take that and move forward? And I must admit, I do get a bit of a kick out of seeing the kind of brand evolution on all of those crates because they're reused and they kind of appear in lots of different places. So it was elements like that were really important, working with our agency partner Interbrand to kind of bring that to life and sort of kind of explore or prosecute what made that, so integral to the brand. And then I think it was about the fact that, we were endeavoring to go on this project to modernize, but we were still sitting in a very old building waiting for a brand new one to come out of the water. And so how did we kind of ensure that the brand felt right in, those, now it was a couple of years it ended up being. And it was really kind of breaking down key elements of the creative platform. So things like photography, acknowledging that we're not super polished as a brand, that, there's a grittiness around the place, around seafood in of itself, and kind of really trying to define those aspects. And then once we came to the sort of launch sort of phase in terms of building out all of those assets, it was, okay, how do we ensure that still feels that we've got this beautiful new brand and beautiful kind of new mark and everything, but how do we bring out that heritage piece in those creative elements? I think, I was really happy with where those things landed, but I think a lot of the heritage also was in kind of acknowledging and taking those stakeholders on the journey along with us.
And those checkpoints right along the way of like, okay, if we're going to get from A to B, how do we have those regular check-ins to make sure this is actually doing what it needs to do?
Yeah, and that reassurance for key stakeholders, including from board level and then across key customer sets, that was the focus for us. It was, we were not throwing away, what had been so well kind of solidified in what it was. We were building on it and we were evolving it into the kind of ultimate destination, which was the new Sydney fish market.
Yeah, fantastic. And what risks were you most conscious of during that process? And I guess as those risks showed up, how did you mitigate them as you went? Because as you said, it's such a big, there's so many opinions, I would imagine, around what this new brand, like more than a lot of other brands. I think the amount of opinions and stakeholders and check-ins that you had to do.
Yeah.
And it would feel at a lot of times quite risky. And we've spoken a lot on the podcast recently about the need to acknowledge the risks, but also to be bold in your approach, because that's just what it takes to be a leading marketer in 2026. So mitigate those risks as they popped up. And what was your approach to managing them?
So I think, the biggest risk for us was the stakeholder risk, that you had this very complex group of stakeholders that you were sort of taking on this journey. Not all of them understood why and the timing of which. And I think, in terms of mitigating that risk, I certainly learned a lot from that process. And it wasn't always perfect, but it was really, really about the kind of stepping stones into that sort of ultimate launch that we made in 2022. Kind of bringing them along that journey and hearing from them as well what their interpretation of that brand was. And what we captured during those sort of stakeholder kind of interviews, and that process was hugely important. Like I cannot undersell how important that was for us, not only for my understanding as a marketer who'd only been in the business for sort of 12 months.
Yeah, wow.
But for, the agency and then ultimately for what we delivered. And so I think it was really around, hearing from them, but then those regular check. And I think the other part was like, of course, I wanted to get this job done. Like I was like, okay, we've got this brand platform. We're ready to sit there with the board and kind of take them through it. And then we got a signal of like, you've got to pause. There's a lot going on kind of in the context of the business at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just slow this down? And of course, that wasn't my favorite outcome, but it was the right thing and the right timing for that ultimately. So I think, that was kind of key risk for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was sort of mitigating that risk around the timing. How does that show up for people? And a lot of it was around the narrative that we built when we launched it. So, really signaling it as that kind of key step in a transformation that was coming. And I think, building that narrative was really strong for us because it sort of gave people the rationale as to why. And then I think, ultimately the impact was massive, particularly internally, but, we got great feedback externally as well. Of course, there's, a few naysayers along the way, but that's all part of the fun, isn't it?
All part of the process. So and that's the thing. And there you have it, is that what I'm hearing from that is just really making sure that you do that stakeholder management early. You ask the questions. You genuinely want to understand where they've been so that you can then form where they're going. And if you do those regular check-ins as you go, because often when you're moving at pace, it is hard and it can be forgotten to do the regular check-ins. I think it sounds like with the way in which you managed it, of like, we have to make this move, we have to go bold, but we have to acknowledge that this is a process and a long process at that. Most rebrands would probably take maybe 3 to 6 months to work through. This was really heading into the years to work through, right, to get it to come to completion. So no, that's some really good insight there.
And also just to add to that, I think it was the recognition that, the launch was one thing in of itself, and then it was kind of the evolution from the launch period into the ultimate launch of the new Sydney Fish Market.
Pre-launch launch.
Exactly. And kind of acknowledging that the brand would evolve through that period as well. And I think now we're really starting to see it come to the fore, which is super exciting. But again, sort of that non-traditional kind of approach to a rebrand. Yeah.
Yeah. And having to be adaptable, right? Like the way you had it planned out in your head of like, right, this is how it needs to go. And then having to adapt as these challenges popped up is probably the art and the magic, in there all at once.
Yeah.
I'm sure there would have been moments where you just need to take a deep breath and go, right, how do we move forward? So if we look now, we're just going to change tracks a little bit and move towards sort of the commercial reality aspects of, of what you've been doing. So how do you connect the marketing activity now? And I guess let me just premise this, because obviously now you've moved into a phase where, the big opening has been done, and now it's really about bringing in these not only existing people who are aware of Sydney Fish Market, but new visitors, both from an international point of view with tourism, but also from a domestic point of view as well. So as you start to move, that the shine wears off, the openings now completed, everybody's, got their big photo with the ribbon and so on, is okay, well now how do you connect that marketing activity to start to look at those revenue and outcomes? And because you have so many different commercial outcomes and ways in which you bring people into the funnel, how are you managing all of that now in sort of 2026?
Yeah, look, it's a
big question.
And I think what I would say ultimately the biggest focus for us in our portfolio, there's, our seafood trading, it runs and we're supporting that from a marketing perspective. It's B2B trading. There's key customers across that set, but that's kind of running and we're supporting that from a marketing perspective. Really where we need to come to the fore now is in our visitor experience. So it's ultimately commercially where Sydney Fish Market has the most opportunity to kind of make a gain from, this new venue. And so for me, really it is, and these are both, I will say, business cases that we've taken to a board for, approval, and now we're, rolling those out.
Yep.
And again, it's that, how do those things evolve? Because you can do a really incredible business case, and that process itself was, a lot of learning and a lot of kind of, again, that sort of stakeholder piece came through. But now it's kind of, okay, the proof is going to be in the pudding ultimately. And how are we kind of commercially ensuring success there? And I think it mostly is around, kind of stepping into it and sort of, we're testing things, but we are coming from a strong foundation. So we have this strength of the brand. In the case of Sydney Seafood School, it's, 35 years of heritage there. How does it look in a new space? And I think commercially for me, it's around testing, but also checking in regularly. So, whilst we're only, I think, nearly 2 months into the process, it is, kind of balancing where we think strategically we need to go with how are we performing, but ultimately kind of walking before we run, because I think there's big vision here, right? But how that kind of comes through into the commercials is still kind of, yet to be seen, I think, in lots of ways. So from my perspective, as we sort of move forward into the year, it is kind of relying on the strength of that business case, but also kind of finessing as you go. So even down to sort of product level, if we're getting early indications that something isn't performing, why is it not performing? Is it the content of the product? Is it the channels to market? And how are we kind of fine tuning that as we go? And it kind of has to be at that granular level at this point,
because you're learning for the first time, right? Like these are all new experiences, new ways people can engage with you. There's no proven sort of model at this point to be like, yeah, this is absolutely going to land. This is where we should put our marketing investment. Because at this point, to your point, it's early days.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I would say on the retail side of the business, we've got 40 retailers. That's a doubling of our retail footprint. Obviously, we've been so fortunate to be, running off the momentum of this launch. And a lot of that strategy is really honing in on earned media and really kind of driving that PR machine as far as we can go. But again, what's the rhythm of the place? So we've just launched it. We've had some big moments in terms of opening, Lunar New Year. We've got Easter coming up. That kind of then play forward in terms of marketing activity. And we could have thrown the all singing, all dancing kind of launch within reason because we don't have massive budget.
Yeah.
For me, it was kind of, again, the walk before you run. So we're going to really enjoy the momentum of this earned media. But when do things start to get trickier? And from my perspective, it's, again, leaning on the kind of foundation that we have in terms of rhythm of the place. Summer is a big seafood consuming period. It's also a big tourism period in Sydney. What happens post-Easter? And really kind of starting to sort of channel our activity into those periods where we think and anticipate that there may be a kind of, a little bit of a tail off. But again, speaking to our retailers, because I'm not here 24/7 as much as I'd like to be, how are they experiencing the rhythm of visitation? What are the kind of softer periods during a day or a week? And kind of listening to them and kind of, trying to work with them to ensure their success as well, because we're all in it together. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's some great points in there, right? In terms of, okay, well, if you've got this, energy and momentum behind the opening and you've got people that are coming in that you can start to understand how they're moving through the funnel, what ways are they engaging, what are the cross-sell opportunities, where if you've got someone that's come through a base of the Sydney school and they can now become, and do other things within the market. That's a really interesting play. And also a lot of other conversations I've been having recently around this whole concept of like full utilization, right? So it's like, if you're open 12 hours a day, well, there's a 12-hour opportunity to maximize, visitation and utilization to really derive that commercial return on investment for those retailers that are showing up. So I'm sure that this will all, and I think it's interesting because, in a lot of other businesses, you would find this place where it's like, yeah, we've been at this for a few years now. We know. What's really interesting about this is that you are charting the path as you go, right? So all of these, and that in itself is a challenge, because the data that you would normally draw upon, like, we do as marketers, we draw upon that data, we make decisions. In your case, that data's not there, right? So you're going to have to continue to make those big, bold decisions that you've been making over the last few years as you chart this, path. And then you look back and you go, oh, well, that worked out really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's kind of also kind of leaning on the metrics that you do have. So whilst your visitation may not be at this point kind of representative of what it's going to be moving forward, because you're on this incredible momentum of launch.
Yeah.
What are the kind of metrics you're picking up on, the social side? We perform very, very well on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So, how are we engaging there? What are the metrics kind of telling us in that space? And again, that just finessing as you go in terms of that ultimate sort of mix of all the activity that's happening. And I think the point you make is really strong in terms of how do they spend their time here. But then also for me, if you're a Sydney-sider, I want you to come back again and again. And I want you to feel that there's something each time that you'll discover that's differently. So how does that come through in the marketing? But also ultimately knowing all the things that you can do while you're here. It's a pretty overwhelming place. Like, there's thousands of people, there's 40 retailers, there's tours, there's a seafood school.
There's a lot going on.
Exactly. And so how do we ensure that those sorts of key aspects of it are coming through for people and that they do ultimately want to spend time in this place, that it's not a kind of tick and flick.
Yeah.
It is it's a kind of much loved sort of staple of a Sydney sider's, time. Yeah.
100%. And when you look at the true, like when we go into sort of lifetime value and true return on investment, the magic and the win is really in the number of times you can get them to come back. And,
Absolutely.
we've got a pretty strong population in Sydney here of those, like that core base, finding those ways and finding those avenues to be able to bring them back, win them back, and then really increase the return on investment that you're going to create from that new acquisition. And this is, the constant marketer's challenge is like, how much do we invest in this new acquisition to get people to come for the first time? And because the cost of media, because the cost of winning a new customer is so high now, then how do we really make sure that once we've paid for them once, how do we keep them, grow them, get that leverage to ultimately really flick that return on investment up into the 5, 6, 7s and ideally double-digit growth, right?
Absolutely. And I think for us, like, again, it's sort of that progress over perfection kind of piece, like where we don't have a sophisticated view of who these customers are currently. And, you can see the kind of pipeline moving forward in terms of the key kind of strategic projects for us.
Yeah.
But for me, it was sort of, I grappled a lot early on with the fact that we didn't have that view of it, that we didn't have proper kind of CRM just based purely on, the way that the customer visits Sydney market. Ultimately, we have it in different facets of the business. But I think it was sort of, rather than trying to kind of bite off this massive thing in that transition, it was, okay, we're going to get there. And then we acknowledge that we need to kind of build from there in terms of that kind of customer lifetime value and building out profiles and really truly understanding who the customer is, and then kind of working across that very multifaceted kind of, setup of the way, retail, visitor experience, all of those things. How do we kind of ensure that they're all sort of singing together to move forward and build that from there? So I think that's on the list for 20.
Oh, well, we've tackled the initial few points this morning and just go and whiteboard it this afternoon and you'll have this solution ready to rock and roll, because that's actually a really good segue into sort of this final part around the consumer journey and, the lifetime value, which we've started to touch on, is really, thinking through that experience and that, sequencing of what happens first, what happens second and third. When you look at just the sheer opportunity available that you've now created, how do you see, those consumers moving through the funnel, and where do you see those opportunities? I mean, what do you, I guess, especially for listeners that are listening in, where are you looking to find this? Because I think your unique perspective is really interesting, because you're on the cusp of this, of this next phase, and you've already had to do so much of the strategic thinking, but now you're in the phase of charting that path. So while this is, top of mind, what are the sort of some of the considerations, the things that you're thinking about, the hoods that you want to look under to really extract some of that value now that you've put so much into this opening moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, ultimately for me, it's kind of delineating the customer groups into sort of two kind of key broad groups, and that would be a Sydney sider and then a tourist, whether they're domestic or international. And from my perspective, across the kind of key aspects of our business, retail and visitor experience, how are we tailoring the offering within those two groups that it really kind of shines through and there's balance across there? So you don't want your retail offering to be too touristy. You want a local to come and feel that they're having a market experience, that they can get some lunch, that they, can have a glass of wine on a Thursday night, all of those things. But you also want your tourists to come and have a massive seafood platter and enjoy the beautiful Blackwattle Bay kind of vantage point, all of those sorts of things.
And in their mind, like, because that's really is really unique from a psychological point of view, is that I'm only here once, I'm going to make the most of it versus I'm coming regularly. So basket size, for the tourist, it might be right. You're going to get that extra basket size, so to speak, whereas the Sydney is going to come back 5 times.
Exactly. And so it really is, it's almost at that kind of granular level in terms of what is the offering across both of those groups. And then obviously then it ladders down into the kind of channels and how you're targeting those people and kind of moving them through the funnel. We've been very, very fortunate that there's this earned media machine kind of running behind us. And, even on socials, I think, as you said before, you'd have to be living under a rock to have not seen it. And I'm getting, even myself just kind of bombarded. Those sorts of things are humming. And then for us, it's okay, are we kind of, do we have a sense of the visitation across those core groups? And then B, how are we working with our retailers, but then in our own sort of portfolio to ensure that there is that feeling that when you come here that there's something for you specifically based on your needs. And then I think the extension of that is then moving them down through that funnel. I'm very conscious of the fact that you interact with our brand long before you arrive to the big beautiful building. And so how are we particularly internationally showing up? Because we've been very fortunate to not have to really try very hard previously. How do we now ensure that, Opera House, Sydney Harbour Bridge and Sydney Fish Market are the top three?
The iconic,
Exactly. So, I think as we look forward into the next financial year, it'll be really about defining those things. And, switching that earned play always will be massive for us. The brand just does beautifully. It generates media in those key, consumption periods. Let's keep that humming. And then what are all the things that sort of flow off that? And then, massively about activation as well. So what's happening in those quieter months? What's attracting
to
someone
stimulate
that what's the loyalty kind of platform look like? And also what are the barriers to visitation as well? Is car parking a challenge or access, and really kind of breaking those things down to ensure that we're understanding why people are dropping out if they are at certain points, but, similarly listening to their feedback as part of that as well. So, it's often the best insight that I get sometimes is walking around on the retail floor with a high-vis vest on and having people come up and ask me questions or give me feedback. And you feel you're living it. And, most of the time I agree with them. And so that sort of stuff is really golden at this point in the kind of journey when you're just sort of post-launch. And then it'll be around ensuring that kind of viability moving forward. Where our visitation targets are 6 million, I think it'll head towards 10. But how do we ensure that for years and years to come for the ultimate success of the organisation, but of course our retailers as part of that?
100%. I think there's some gold nuggets in there. And I love that you're thinking about, that personalized experience for each of the visitors that are coming through of like, how can you create those magic moments, that they'll remember and then they'll want to be drawn back to. There's also a lot of history for people who have grown up knowing the Sydney Fish Market and the ways in which they've engaged with it to then take forward into this new era. So I think there was just like, some really gold nuggets in there, Lauren, for marketers thinking about, how they would approach this in the same way across their brands. So I want to ask you one last question that I just think I always like to ask this at the end of, if you were sort of thinking about those CMOs and marketers out there and the landscape and the challenges that they are facing, what sort of, maybe the one piece of advice that you'd like to share with them that you think is paramount at this stage of the marketing journey that we're all on?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I think the need for a CMO to have that commercial background, it's the biggest thing I've learned in my time here at Sydney Fish Market is how much that sort of underpins activity moving forward. I think the role of a CMO is evolving greatly and, your ability to show up at that executive level with that commercial standing is super important. And then, I think ultimately, I think I said it before, but progress over perfection. For me, that was always
gold.
I'm having these moments of almost imposter syndrome where I'm saying, oh, it's not quite where it needs to be, but as long as you're moving forward on that journey and you understand, all of the moving parts in there, that's better than standing still and expecting that one day this perfect thing's going to come along, because ultimately won't be. So for me, that's the biggest part of this role. It's been so richly challenging and rewarding, but ultimately when I reflect on it, it's really just that, towards that progress. And then also kind of when you're there, I mean, I always sort of thought it'd be this moment where the flag goes on on the top of the hill.
I made it.
I climbed the mountain and I'm feeling really excited, but I just learnt that no, the flag goes on the hill and then we move on to the next. So, take the little moments where you can as well, like through that journey is like, just have little moments of reflection, particularly for your team, because, ultimately I'm nothing without them sort of standing behind doing, executing across this very diverse kind of, delivery. So that's a big part for me as well.
I think that's brilliant. Some of those, there's so many takeaways just in what you've said in that 1 minute. But what I think is really valuable is, and I hear this a lot as well, and it's great advice, is those micro moments,
Yeah,
because a lot of it is you're just moving on to the next thing. It's just the way we do business now. It's the
yeah,
way the world moves. And if you don't take the time to sort of pat yourself on the back, but
yeah,
also to pat the team on the back, it does all get washed up in just these bigger objectives. And I think that what you've said there is just
absolutely.
absolute gold,
Yeah.
because it is. And I find myself, I'm listening going, this is really good. Like,
Yeah.
this is really
Yeah.
good
And
stuff.
I think I would also add to that as well, like I've recognized probably in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, the importance of managing myself through that
Yeah.
process. You're
Yeah.
so focused on everybody else, managing up, managing to the board, managing the team. How was I managing myself? Because ultimately, if I wasn't doing that, I wasn't going to be able to get those other people there with me. So that
Like,
was
how are
the
you showing up,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. And keeping that balance when I could have worked 24/7 for over a year and still not got to perfection. So that was a big piece for me as well.
And maybe just a couple of things on that is like, what are the things that you believe? I mean, I could ask you so many more questions, but what do you think? And what do you believe are the things that made a difference for you? Because you've been under a lot of pressure in this role for, a significant period of time in the lead up. Are there a few things that you're just like, oh God, that works? Like, that's really helpful for me, especially when you are every day either dealing with massive pressure, which most marketers are, you're putting out fires, which most
Yeah.
marketers are, and sometimes in a lot of cases, you're a counselor for the team.
Yes.
They've got, we've all got lives and we're complex humans. In all of that you've just shared, that wisdom that you've shared with us, is there any things that are specific for you that like this really helped me to just get perspective or to regroup when the moments were tough, to keep
Yeah.
powering through?
Yeah, I think, on the professional side, I would say that kind of prioritization and almost reviewing of those priorities in kind of real time was really
Yeah.
important to me, but also, kind of explaining to the team where we were at any given time and
Mhm.
really kind of being open in that process. I think that builds rapport, but it also kind of sets them in train that, yeah, okay, as we talked about before, but, we don't have all the answers here. So
Yeah.
I think for me, that was a big part. And then, personally, I think it's like really simple things that you read about and you kind of like, yeah, I've got that under control, but a routine,
Yeah.
not working until, 10 o'clock at night every night, really, again, kind of managing yourself through that process. And then like really basic things like eating your breakfast and,
Well, what our mothers taught us.
all of those things that you kind of don't feel that you're getting done in a day.
Yeah.
And also being kind to yourself when you feel that you've hit 5 p.m. and the work has, it starts then in terms of
Yeah.
you've managed all throughout this day and then you kind of get to, and sometimes I just had to be like, it's all right.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we'll go again,
Start
as
fresh.
opposed to let's sit here for 5 hours and kind of ensure that we've kind of ticked all these things off. So I think, just kind of being kind to myself through that process, which I didn't always nail, but I tried.
No, look, again, I think it's incredibly valuable. But I mean, I was just speaking to my team just this month about the value of bandwidth, and that
Oh, yeah,
energy is the new currency. It's,
absolutely.
if we can show up, like even if we're showing up at less hours, but if we can do that better, then
Yeah,
that is just going to be so much more effective. And the power of just being able to think
absolutely.
clearly and move
Yeah,
strategically and make the right decisions instead of the wrong decisions. There's so much value in what you've said in terms of effectiveness and actually getting to the next level. Now, I promised that was the last question, but it's not, because I have one more. And I think you're uniquely placed to speak to this. There's a lot of marketers that often ask me is, well, how do you build that commercial acumen? Like
yeah,
if you've been in the marketing roles, but you haven't necessarily had the
yeah,
opportunity to have that seat at the table, to have the commercial discussions, we all know that there are very real commercial realities in business, but
yes,
you've been very uniquely positioned to have to really evolve into that, to step up into that space. And you've been rewarded as, obviously being named as the CMO of this incredible Sydney fish market.
yeah.
So what are sort of if you were talking right now to a marketer who really wants to improve their commercial acumen,
Mm.
what is it that you would sort of say to them as just, a couple of pearls of wisdom to give them that nudge?
Yeah, I think ultimately for me, and I'll be honest, it wasn't a space I was comfortable in.
Mhm.
As I said before, classically trained marketer, very big on brand and strategy, and not always so concerned about the overall kind of commercial outcome. So I think
Yeah.
it was, first of all, taking the time to really understand, okay, what are the drivers here, and then ultimately what are the metrics that I'm sort of being kind of asked for. And then for me, it was okay, who else in the business is armed here to support me on this journey? So obviously finance is a massive part really ensuring that, whoever it is in that team becomes your business partner as part of it. They understand the decisions that you're making as part of maybe your marketing P&L, but, similarly the cooking school P&L. And that they're kind of with you on that journey, prosecuting those things, because you're going to have very different viewpoints of that ultimately. And then I think, again, other parts of the business, for example, seafood trading is not an area that I was specifically kind of, involved in, but anytime there was kind of commercial activity or presentations and things, being part of that and ultimately prosecuting, asking questions, can you take me through that? I'm not as kind of au fait with that particular kind of, pricing model that you've put together, for example. And so really just kind of taking that time, even though it's not your kind of core priority or, deliverable in that moment, asking those questions. And I think just sort of ultimately being at the table for those things is really important. And then I think, I can't underestimate the power of like having, connections with other CMOs who are kind of going through this as well, and being able to have frank conversations that, maybe you sign a, cone of silence or NDA in your minds where you can talk about these things and ultimately get their advice as well through that process. Because there'll be times, I didn't feel very comfortable. I was like, I don't know what we're talking about, specifically from a commercial perspective, but just kind of taking the time to prosecute that and being like a little bit kind as well in that time. Like, you're on a journey, you will get there ultimately. So, but I think it is the most fruitful part of what I've done here in terms of just really building that skill and feeling really confident that, I'm not daunted by those conversations anymore, and that, I have ultimate confidence in what I can sort of, put up for consideration. Yeah,
absolutely. And what you can contribute. I think, we all talk about confidence a lot and confidence in marketing, but really confidence comes from competence. And if you can build that competence as you go, naturally, and as you said, leaning on those sounding boards and those people in the business, that is brilliant. So there you go, marketers out there listening. That is the pathway. Lauren's just mapped it out for us in 30 seconds. That is the pathway to them really being able to own that. So Lauren, I just want to say a massive thank you to you for joining me today and for being so willing to be so open and share all of these insights with our listeners. If people want to reach out, for just to say, hey, that was awesome, or hey, ask a question, where can they catch you? Where's the best place to catch you?
They can obviously find me on LinkedIn, and I've already kind of had a few people DM me saying that they're so excited about the fish market. And so if you're visiting, let me know and we'll have a coffee and I can take you through. But yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you very much, Lauren. There you have it. Listeners, we have had a fantastic masterclass here on navigating the commercial realities, on taking brands from incredible history to brand new, and also really navigating the challenges that come with a long-awaited launch like the Sydney Fish Market. It has just been such an incredible run-through of what are the distinctive differences that can really push businesses forward and get you to your outcome. So if you've got value from this episode, make sure you hit subscribe to the Black Box of Media and leave a review. It helps more marketers like you unlock the hidden strategies behind performance from a marketing and media advertising perspective. Let's keep this conversation going. If today's episode sparked new ideas or challenged the way you think, which is absolutely what we want, I'd love to hear from you. So drop me a message on LinkedIn and share your biggest takeaway. If you want more insider knowledge, you can listen or watch on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube for future episodes packed with similar insights. So until next time, keep pushing the boundaries, keep testing, and most importantly, keep making media and marketing work hard for you.